What have you done to my hydrangeas? They're not your hydrangeas, Karen, they're mine. I'm calling the police. You'll pay for this. There I was, standing ankle-deep in ruined flower beds, while Karen, the self-appointed empress of our HOA, is shrieking about community standards. If you've ever dealt with someone who thinks their personal vendetta is a public service, smash that like button. Subscribe if you enjoy watching tyrants self-destruct. Grab a snack, because this is the story of how one HOA Karen poured acid on my garden and how I unleashed 10,000 hungry little soldiers on her perfectly manicured lawn. It began with the garden, my little corner of peace, the one part of the neighborhood that felt entirely mine. I had worked for months, turning a plain patch of grass into something worth walking through slowly. Roses that climbed the fence, hydrangeas that spilled blue and purple across the edges, lilies that caught the sunlight like they were lit from inside. It was the kind of yard that made people pause on their evening walks. Some neighbors told me they brought their kids past just so they could see how many colors were blooming that week. I didn't build it for the compliments, though. I built it because it was the only thing that made the chaos of life feel quiet for a while. The garden didn't scream for attention. It was gentle, the way the morning dew clung to petals, the way bees hovered lazily as if they had all the time in the world. Even the air smelled sweeter, touched by lavender and honeysuckle that I had carefully placed to balance the colors. I remember thinking that if happiness had a shape, it would look like this little square of earth. Karen thought otherwise. She lived 2 houses down in the biggest property on the block, a house that looked like it belonged on the cover of some generic suburban magazine. Perfectly trimmed bushes lined her driveway, each cut so severely they could have been measured with a ruler. Her lawn was short, sharp, and uniform, not a blade out of place. To her, nature wasn't beauty, it was control, and control meant power. When she walked by my garden for the first time, she didn't smile. She didn't even acknowledge the butterflies that danced above the roses. She just stared at the colors with this pursed expression, like someone had spilled paint on her carefully pressed white shirt. Neighbors later told me she'd been muttering about violations and standards, how the HOA valued consistency over creativity. None of it made sense, but with Karen, sense was never the point. She needed something to dominate, and my flowers became her battlefield. Looking back, I should have known that the blooms she saw as wild and defiant would eventually push her to act. What I saw as life and healing, she saw as a threat to the rigid little empire she had built out of bylaws and intimidation. At the time, I still believed flowers could soften even the hardest people. I didn't realize yet that Karen wasn't just hard, she was stone, and she was already planning how to crush anything that didn't fit her vision of order. The morning she truly noticed my garden was the day the war began. I was out early with a cup of coffee, watching the way the light touched the petals. It was one of those rare mornings when the whole street was still, just the sound of sprinklers clicking in the distance. Then I saw her. Karen stood at the edge of the sidewalk, her arms folded tightly across her chest, chin tilted slightly upward like she was inspecting a crime scene. She didn't say hello, she didn't wave. She just stood there, staring at the flowers as if their very existence insulted her. I tried to break the tension with a polite nod, the kind neighbors usually exchange without thinking. She didn't nod back. Her eyes were locked on the hydrangeas, their full blooms spilling beyond the neat little line where my property ended and the sidewalk began. I knew what she was thinking. To her, flowers weren't supposed to spill or stretch. They were supposed to sit in tidy little boxes, predictable and controlled. The fact that mine looked alive rather than manicured seemed to irritate her. Her lips moved, though not quite loud enough for me to catch the words. Later, I'd learned from another neighbor that she had been muttering about non-compliance and property values. At the time, it was just a low hum of disapproval, like a teacher whispering corrections under her breath. I remember wondering if she thought the roses were too red, or if the lilies were planted at an angle that offended her sense of geometry. Whatever the reason, she lingered there for several minutes, long enough to make it clear that this wasn't casual curiosity, it was surveillance. When she finally turned to leave, she gave one last sweeping glance over the whole yard, the kind of look someone gives when they've already decided something needs to change. There was no neighborly warmth in it, only calculation. I went back to sipping my coffee, telling myself it was nothing, that some people simply disliked anything different. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. It was as though a line had been drawn in the soil, right alongside my roses, invisible but heavy, separating what I saw as beauty from what she saw as rebellion. What I didn't know that morning was how far she would go to erase that rebellion, and how quickly the flowers she despised would become the spark that lit her fury. The smell hit me before I even saw the damage. It was sharp and chemical, the kind of odor that makes your throat tighten. I stepped into the yard that morning, expecting to see dew sparkling on the petals, maybe a few bees circling lazily. Instead, I froze. The roses were slumped like broken soldiers. The hydrangeas, which had been bursting with color the night before, were now shriveled and streaked black. Even the lilies looked as if someone had pressed fire into their veins. For a moment, I just stood there, coffee cup halfway to my lips, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. Gardens don't die overnight. Flowers wilt, leaves fade, but it happens slowly, gently, like a fading photograph. This was different. This was violent. My garden hadn't wilted. It had been attacked. I crouched down and touched the soil near the hydrangeas. The earth was damp, but not with water. The smell was stronger there, acrid and unmistakable. Acid. Someone had poured acid across the bed in the dark, letting it seep into the roots and scorch everything alive. I could picture it happening, a figure moving through the yard under cover of night, plastic jug in hand, tilting it slowly over the blooms I had nurtured for months. Anger rose in me, hot and shaking. These flowers weren't just decoration, they were therapy, living proof that beauty could be cultivated with patience and care, and now they were nothing but burned stems and blackened leaves. Whoever had done this hadn't just destroyed plants, they had desecrated something personal. I didn't need to wonder long about who was behind it. There was only one person who had glared at my flowers like they were weeds, who muttered about violations and non-compliance. I could see her face in my mind, the tight smile, the clipped tone. Karen. The woman who had turned rules into weapons. She had finally escalated from petty disapproval to outright sabotage. As I stood there, breathing in the sour stench of chemicals, I realized this wasn't just about flowers. This was about control. She wanted me broken, embarrassed, and obedient. Instead, she had given me a reason to fight back. The garden could be replanted. But the insult of acid on my blooms was going to bloom into something far larger, something she would never see coming. The very next day, Karen strutted around the neighborhood with a stack of papers in her hand, waving them like a judge, about to hand down a sentence. She knocked on doors, spoke in that loud, authoritative voice of hers, and announced that my garden had been in violation of the HOA's guidelines all along. According to her, there was a rule about color uniformity that required flower beds to remain within an approved palette. I listened to her speech from my porch, almost laughing at the absurdity. The bylaws I had read when I moved in said nothing of the sort. They covered trash pickup, fencing, and lawn height, but nothing about whether roses could be red or hydrangeas could be blue. She claimed my yard created visual disruption and lowered collective property values. The neighbors nodded politely, though most of them looked more uncomfortable than convinced. I noticed that no one actually asked to see where in the handbook this mysterious rule was written. That was the power Karen wielded. She spoke with such certainty that people assumed there must be truth behind her words, even when the logic wobbled like a bad foundation. Later that afternoon, a fresh violation notice appeared in my mailbox. It was printed with official-looking headers, the HOA's logo stamped at the top, and a warning about escalating fines if I failed to comply. I knew the document wasn't real, not in the sense of being formally issued by the HOA board. Karen had drafted it herself, just as she had with countless other neighbors she'd harassed. Still, the sight of that paper carried a weight. It felt like a declaration of war, delivered in the language of bureaucracy. The most infuriating part was how she managed to turn herself into the authority and everyone else into suspects. She framed my garden not as a personal project of care and healing, but as a danger to the community. It was manipulative theater, complete with props and printed notices. And she was good at it, too good, because I could already sense some neighbors pulling back from me, unsure whether aligning with me would mean becoming her next target. That evening, I sat on the porch staring at the ruined hydrangeas, the violation notice still folded in my pocket. I understood that this was no longer about flowers. It was about her need to dominate every inch of this neighborhood. She had chosen me as her example, and the acid was just her opening move. When I finally confronted her, she didn't flinch or deny it. She just tilted her head, fixed me with that smug half-smile, and spoke as if she were a teacher explaining a basic lesson to a slow student. "Maybe you just overwatered," she said, her tone syrupy sweet, the kind of voice that hides a knife behind its back. My flowers, still blackened and brittle from the acid, were in plain view between us, yet she had the audacity to act as though it was my own fault. I told her directly that I knew what she had done, that the smell of chemicals in my soil wasn't from overwatering, that someone had poured something destructive into my beds. Her expression never changed. She lifted one shoulder in a careless shrug and said, "Maybe I should be more careful with what I plant, because some things simply don't belong in this neighborhood." That word, belong, carried a weight that pressed into my chest. She wasn't just talking about flowers anymore. The entire exchange felt unreal, like a bad play where one actor refuses to acknowledge the obvious stage set around them. Her eyes flicked toward the other houses, scanning to see who might be watching, who might overhear, who might be swayed to her side. She didn't care about whether she was right. She cared about maintaining her image of control. If she could make me doubt myself, even for a second, she would win. I walked back toward my porch, fists clenched, telling myself not to give her the satisfaction of seeing how furious I was. Behind me, her voice rang out again, louder now, carrying across the street. She was telling another neighbor that my plants were diseased, that she had tried to warn me, that I refused to listen. It was like watching someone lay bricks for a story she had already decided to build. What unsettled me most wasn't the lie itself, but the confidence with which she told it. She believed her own script, and in her world, my burned flowers had become the evidence of my negligence rather than her cruelty. It was a game of gaslighting, and she was practiced at it. Standing there on my porch, looking at the ruined garden, I realized she didn't need truth to win. She just needed people to hear her version first and loudest. The neighborhood began to hum with low whispers after the acid attack. People did not want to take sides openly, but you could feel the unease whenever conversations turned to lawns or flowers. At first I thought it might be my imagination, the way I caught neighbors pausing when I walked by, their voices trailing off as if they had been discussing something I was not supposed to hear. Then I noticed how carefully people avoided eye contact when I tried to smile or greet them. It was as though Karen's version of the story had already been circulating, shaping the atmosphere before I had a chance to explain. Some neighbors clearly wanted nothing to do with the drama. They kept their heads down, focused on their own yards, and retreated quickly inside when they saw me outside, tending what little was left of my garden. Others seemed almost eager to repeat Karen's talking points, saying things like, "It's a shame when landscaping doesn't match the community," or "rules exist for a reason." Those words carried the echo of her voice, even if they were delivered politely. A few were braver. "Mr. Harlan from across the street muttered one evening that Karen had been making everyone miserable for years and that she thrived on fear. He told me he admired that I had stood my ground, though he said it in a hushed tone, glancing toward her house, as though she might appear at any moment. It struck me how even the simplest kindness had to be whispered, like resistance in a place where one person held too much sway. I started to see the split in the neighborhood more clearly as the days went by. People who had been victims of her endless fines and false citations nodded at me in quiet solidarity, though few would say anything directly. Others, perhaps terrified of becoming her next target, stayed firmly in her orbit, repeating her lines about standards and consistency as if reading from a script. The air around us grew heavier, not from the ruined flowers, but from the knowledge that everyone was waiting to see how far she would take it. Karen had succeeded in making people afraid of her power, but fear has a way of curdling into resentment. I could sense that resentment building, simmering just below the surface. What none of us knew then was how spectacularly it would eventually boil over. It did not take long before she decided to escalate in the most predictable way. One morning, as I was raking up the blackened remains of what used to be my roses, a patrol car rolled slowly down the street. The flashing lights reflected off the windows of my house, and within seconds, Karen was marching out of her driveway, waving her phone like a trophy. She had called the police. The officer stepped out, looking more weary than alarmed. He glanced at me, then at Karen, and you could tell immediately this was not his first encounter with her. She pointed at my yard, her voice high and sharp, insisting that my flower beds were a biohazard, threatening the safety of the community. She claimed the plants were diseased, that the soil was contaminated, and that I was ignoring official HOA directives to remove them. Every sentence was delivered with such conviction, it almost sounded believable. I explained calmly that the flowers had been destroyed by chemicals, that the only danger present was what had been poured into my soil. The officer crouched down, sniffed the air, and straightened with a skeptical look. He asked Karen if she had applied anything to the beds. She gasped as if insulted, clutching her phone against her chest and declaring that she would never stoop to such behavior. What made the scene unforgettable was the way he looked past her and noticed the bottles lined up along her garage wall. The labels were clear from where we stood, heavy-duty herbicides in containers of industrial-strength cleaner. Karen stammered, trying to explain that they were for routine maintenance, but the officer's expression said everything. He knew. Still, he was careful. He told her that, unless she could provide evidence of an actual violation, there was nothing criminal about a neighbor planting flowers. He turned to me, suggested I document the damage, and left it at that. Karen stood frozen in the driveway, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for a new script. The irony was that her attempt to frame me had backfired. Instead of branding me as careless, she had revealed herself as the kind of person who calls the police over flower beds. Neighbors peeked through blinds and curtains, watching the entire display. By the time the cruiser pulled away, it was not me they were whispering about. It was her. That night, just after the neighborhood had gone quiet, I found something sitting on my porch. At first it looked like another one of her self-styled notices, folded crisply and tucked into an envelope marked with the same made-up letterhead she had been using for weeks. I sighed, assuming it was another round of empty threats about community guidelines and penalties that didn't actually exist. But when I slid the paper free, there was something else underneath. The violation notice itself was as ridiculous as ever, accusing me of endangering property values by maintaining unauthorized flora. The language was stiff and official sounding, the kind of text designed to intimidate someone who doesn't know better. I almost tossed it straight into the recycling bin, but curiosity got the better of me. The envelope had more weight than just a single sheet of paper. Beneath the printed notice was a thin slip of paper with a store logo across the top. My stomach dropped as I read the words. It was a receipt, dated only 2 nights before, for 2 gallons of industrial-strength hydrochloric acid. The address, printed at the bottom, was the home improvement store on the other side of town. And stamped right above the total cost was a name. Hers. Karen's full name, bold and undeniable. For a few minutes, I just stood there in my doorway, the porch light buzzing above me, the papers shaking in my hand. It felt like holding both the crime and the confession at once. She had slipped the notice into my mailbox to prove her authority, but the receipt must have clung to the back of the page by accident. In her rush to intimidate, she had exposed the evidence of what she had done. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at it, wondering if she even realized her mistake. The neat lines of the violation notice contrasted almost comically with the raw proof of her attack. It was like she had written the script of her defense and handed me the smoking gun in the same breath. The garden outside my window lay in ruins, but for the first time since the attack, I felt a spark of control return. She had wanted to make me doubt myself. Instead, she had placed her guilt directly in my hands. And I knew I would not waste the opportunity. The idea came to me over coffee with an old friend who had spent his career studying insects. He had retired from university work years ago, but still carried the spark of a scientist who sees the world through curious eyes. I told him about the acid, the violation notices, and the endless drama of living next to Karen. He listened quietly, nodding now and then, until I finally ran out of words. He sipped from his mug, set it down gently, and with a twinkle in his eyes said, "You know what ruins a lawn faster than chemicals? Caterpillars." At first I thought he was joking. The image of tiny green creatures crawling across Karen's pristine yard made me laugh out loud. But he leaned forward, serious now, and explained how a single release of larvae could strip leaves, flowers, and even grass within days. They were harmless to people, perfectly natural, and completely unstoppable once they got going. He told me about conservation groups that actually sell caterpillars to raise funds for butterfly sanctuaries, boxes filled with wriggling little agents of chaos waiting for a place to feed. The more he explained, the more the absurd idea began to take shape in my mind. Karen had chosen acid, a weapon of destruction meant to kill beauty. I could choose nature itself, a gentle but relentless force that would not break laws or leave chemical scars. It would be poetic, a kind of living justice. Where she had poured poison, I would release life. I spent the rest of the day researching, combing through websites that offered bulk caterpillar kits for schools and fundraising events. Each listing described how the insects would feed voraciously before transforming, leaving behind nothing but chewed stems and eventually delicate wings. The thought of Karen's perfectly trimmed hedges stripped bare, her manicured roses reduced to skeleton stalks, filled me with a satisfaction I had not felt since before the attack. By the time evening fell, I had made my decision. I placed the order, 10,000 caterpillars on their way from a sanctuary fundraiser that would use the proceeds for conservation work. In a strange way, it felt noble, like supporting a good cause, while preparing the sweetest revenge imaginable. Karen would never see it coming. She had her acid. I had an army of green mouths ready to march across her kingdom. I treated the order confirmation like a secret handshake, a tiny digital proof that the plan was actually moving from thought into reality. The supplier sent a polite email thanking me for supporting their butterfly sanctuary and explaining the care instructions in careful, almost reverent language. The boxes would arrive overnight, chilled to keep the larvae dormant and calm, tucked into insulated liners with a sheet of instructions that looked like something intended for school science projects. Reading those instructions made the whole thing feel less like sabotage and more like a strange civic experiment. I told myself it was nature answering nature, a tit-for-tat administered by living things rather than lawsuits or insults. Logistics turned out to be its own small puzzle. 10,000 caterpillars do not come in a single neat parcel. They arrived in 12 small boxes, each labeled with the sanctuary logo and the words educational kit. I picked them up at the courier depot late in the evening, the fluorescent lights making the cardboard look almost institutional. My hands smelled faintly of the cold pack inside and a sweet earthy scent that hinted at the larvae tucked within. The driver gave me a curious look as he handed over the final box, and I tried to smile without sounding like I was confessing to a crime. I recruited 2 friends to help, because even a clandestine act loses some of its sharpness when executed alone. They were both people who loved a good story and who had laughed when I first described the plan over beers. We sat around my kitchen table that night, laying out the care sheets and plotting a route that would minimize time on the street and avoid curious neighbors. We talked quietly so the house would not carry our voices too far, and the plan took shape. Dawn, before anyone was up, placed the boxes at strategic points along the edge of Karen's property, where the caterpillars would find the easiest path to her roses and shrubs. It felt oddly clinical, the way surgeons plan an incision, and it made my hands shake a little. On the morning of, the air was thin and sweet, the kind of quiet that makes you think the world has paused to listen. The insulation liners were still cool when we opened the boxes, and pale wriggling shapes stirred like tiny green wishes. Carrying them across the dew-slick grass, every footstep felt heavy with the absurdity of the moment. We set the kits down gently at the fence line, closed the lids half an inch so the wind could not scatter them, and left as quietly as we had arrived. Walking back toward my house, with my heart thudding in my chest, felt like the final act of a play where the curtain had dropped and the audience had not yet begun to applaud. The release itself was both anticlimactic and exhilarating. We had pictured a flood of green bodies pouring out all at once, like a scene from an old horror movie, but the reality was quieter. As the first light of morning stretched across the neighborhood, I knelt by the fence line and lifted the flaps of the boxes. The caterpillars blinked in the sunlight, slow at first, their tiny bodies adjusting to the warmth. Then, one by one, they began to move, little arches and stretches as they crept onto the blades of grass and the stems of weeds. Within minutes, the trickle became a steady crawl. The grass seemed alive, shifting as hundreds of small mouths discovered the feast waiting for them. They moved with a kind of patient determination, not hurried, not chaotic, just certain of where they needed to go. I watched as they found her shrubs first, the ones she pruned with military precision every Sunday afternoon. They climbed the stems in silent procession, and soon the first leaves were trembling under the soft tearing of their jaws. My friends and I stood back, half in awe, half in disbelief. The sound was faint, but there, if you listened closely, like the rustle of paper being torn in another room. Watching them work felt surreal, almost holy in its own strange way. Karen had used poison to wipe out life. I was using life itself as the response. By the time the neighborhood began to stir, the invasion was well underway. From my kitchen window, I could see her roses already pocked with small holes, the glossy perfection of their leaves giving way to ragged edges. The caterpillars did not discriminate. They spread evenly across the yard, a quiet army leaving a trail of skeletonized stems in their wake. I kept expecting to feel guilt, but it never came. Instead, there was a calm satisfaction, the sense of balance being restored. She had struck first with acid and lies. I had answered with something she could not fine, threaten, or explain away. The boxes were empty now, folded and tucked into my trash bin, leaving no trace of their journey. What remained was the sight of nature reclaiming a space that had been held hostage by vanity. It was a beginning, not an end, and I knew the real drama would unfold the moment Karen stepped outside and saw the feast in progress. She came outside just before noon, robes cinched tightly, sunglasses perched on her nose, as if the sun itself was another neighbor she meant to intimidate. At first, she didn't notice. She moved toward her roses with a watering can, humming under her breath, ready to perform her daily ritual of control. Then, she froze. The can tilted in her hand as her eyes locked on the leaves, no longer glossy green but peppered with holes, edges curled and ragged. She crouched to look closer, and when she did, the movement startled a dozen caterpillars into view. They wriggled and stretched along her stems, content and determined. Her scream ripped through the air like a siren. Curtains shifted up and down the block as neighbors peeked out. She dropped the can and began swatting at the plants with her hands, yelling words that tumbled together in a frantic stream. She accused the air, the soil, the HOA, and finally the universe itself. The caterpillars, of course. They didn't care. They kept working, stripping leaf after leaf with mechanical rhythm. Karen danced across her lawn in slippers, shaking branches, shouting about infestations and biohazards. She called for her husband, though no one ever saw him during these tirades. She grabbed her phone and began snapping pictures, ranting into the camera about ecological sabotage. I could hear her from my living room window, her voice carrying like a town crier announcing the end of days. The spectacle drew neighbors into doorways. Some stood with arms folded, clearly savoring the reversal. Others whispered, amused but cautious, unwilling to laugh too loudly within earshot of her fury. For once, though, the laughter was no longer directed at me. Karen had become the show. I watched her collapse onto her knees in front of her once perfect roses, caterpillars wriggling across her slippers as if to crown her with their presence. She slapped at them, squealed, and cursed in a voice far too shrill for the quiet afternoon. Every attempt to drive them away only made her look more desperate. By the time she stumbled back inside, hair sticking to her face and slippers coated with chewed leaves, the neighborhood had seen everything. Her scream still echoed down the street, but the balance had shifted. She was no longer the enforcer of rules. She was the spectacle of her own unraveling, and the caterpillars kept eating. By evening, the crisis had grown too large for Karen to manage on her own. Her roses were stripped nearly bare. The hydrangeas that had once been her pride were now crawling with green bodies, and even her carefully edged lawn looked like it had been grazed by invisible sheep. Instead of admitting defeat, she called for an emergency HOA meeting. Flyers appeared in mailboxes with bold lettering about a neighborhood ecological emergency. According to her announcement, a malicious neighbor had introduced invasive species that posed a direct threat to property values and community safety. The wording was as dramatic as it was transparent. The meeting took place in the community center at the end of the street. Karen arrived first, arms full of poster boards covered in photographs of her ravaged yard. She arranged them across the front table like evidence in a courtroom, each one marked with arrows and captions written in thick black marker. She had even taped a caterpillar inside a plastic container to serve as her star witness, holding it up with a flourish as the neighbors filed in. Her opening speech was pure theater. She described waking up to a plague of worms that had descended like a biblical curse. She spoke of the sleepless night she had endured, listening to them crunch her roses. She warned that without immediate HOA intervention, the entire neighborhood would be swallowed whole by the infestation. Every sentence was punctuated by a glance in my direction, though she never used my name. She didn't have to. When it was my turn to speak, I kept my voice steady. I explained the acid attack, the ruined flowers, and the receipt I had found tucked into her false violation notice. I held up the slip of paper with her signature and the purchase of hydrochloric acid clearly printed. A murmur rippled through the room, neighbors leaning forward to see the evidence. The tables turned quickly. Instead of nodding along with her usual bluster, people began asking pointed questions. Why had she been buying acid in bulk? Why had she created violation notices that didn't exist in the bylaws? Why did her story change every time someone pressed for details? For once, Karen was on the defensive, her voice rising higher with every denial. She waved her arms, insisted on conspiracies, and pointed at me as if volume alone could erase the proof. But the room no longer belonged to her. The authority she had built with threats and paperwork was crumbling, and the murmurs sounded very much like the beginning of open revolt. Neighbors who had sat silent for years began to find their voices that night. At first it was cautious, almost timid, as if they were testing whether anyone else would join them. Then, one by one, they stepped forward and added their own stories to the pile of evidence against Karen. It felt less like a meeting and more like a confessional, with each person unburdening themselves of the harassment they had carried quietly for too long. Mrs. Alvarez, who lived on the corner, spoke about the violation notices she had received for her shutters being painted a shade of cream instead of white. She described how Karen had stood on her porch with a clipboard, demanding repainting or threatening fines that were never approved by the actual HOA board. Her voice trembled at first, then steadied as she realized the room was nodding with her, not against her. Next was Tom from across the street, a quiet man who rarely spoke to anyone. He explained how Karen had filed repeated complaints about his teenage son's car being parked on the street overnight. She told the family they were endangering neighborhood safety, even though the car was fully registered and legally parked. He pulled out the stack of written warnings she had left on his windshield, each one printed with the same fake letterhead as the notice she had shoved into my mailbox. Others joined in, each story a piece of a puzzle that revealed her pattern. A family described how she reported them for unauthorized decorations when they hung Christmas lights. Another neighbor recounted how she had stood outside with a camera taking photos of their backyard barbecue, later claiming they were violating noise restrictions. What once seemed like isolated encounters now formed a picture of calculated intimidation. As the testimonies piled up, Karen's expression shifted from defiance to something closer to panic. She tried to interrupt, accusing people of exaggeration or twisting her words, but each denial only made her look smaller. The neighbors who had once stayed quiet out of fear now saw how much power they had when they stood together. By the end of the meeting, the room was no longer divided. It was united, and the lines of loyalty that Karen had relied on had been erased. She had lost the silent compliance of her neighbors, and in that moment, her reign of paper fines and hollow threats began to crumble in earnest. The caterpillars did more than devour her roses and strip her shrubs. They created an odd kind of economy that no one could have predicted. Children from the block began to appear in her yard with jars and shoeboxes, gathering the little green creatures as if they were catching fireflies in summer. They laughed as they worked, racing one another to see who could fill their containers the fastest. It became a game, a scavenger hunt, funded by the chaos Karen had unwittingly invited. At first, she screamed at them to leave, flapping her arms and threatening to call their parents. But the sight of her ranting in her yard, slippers muddy and hair tangled from stress, only added to the amusement. The children ran off with their prizes, and, within days, word spread that they were selling the caterpillars back to butterfly enthusiasts at a local farmer's market. Each jar fetched a few dollars, sometimes more if it held a particularly plump specimen. What had begun as revenge now doubled as an unexpected fundraiser for school trips and weekend candy runs. Neighbors chuckled at the irony. For years Karen had fined them for trivialities, squeezing every cent she could from supposed violations. Now, the community was making money off the very plague that tormented her. Parents who had once feared her glare now encouraged their kids to help with the cleanup, while secretly pocketing the earnings from caterpillar sales. It felt like the neighborhood was finally reclaiming something that had been taken from them, even if it was only a little cash and a lot of satisfaction. Her yard, once the showpiece of the block, had become the local gold mine. The more she sprayed and stomped, the more the caterpillars multiplied, as if mocking her efforts. By the end of the week, children walked past her house, singing songs about butterflies, while their parents exchanged knowing smiles. She had wanted to control the neighborhood with paperwork and threats, but instead, she had created an unintentional market where her downfall was everyone else's gain. The garden she had guarded so fiercely was no longer hers to flaunt. It belonged to the swarm, to the laughter of children, and to the neighbors who finally felt free enough to enjoy the joke. For once, her misery was the community's profit, and no fine or notice could erase that. News has a way of slipping through cracks faster than water, and in Karen's case, it spilled everywhere. A teenager from 2 streets over had filmed her meltdown in front of the roses, capturing every shriek, every wild swing of her arms, and the dramatic fall onto her knees as caterpillars swarmed her slippers. The video was posted online before she even realized it, and by nightfall, it had already gathered thousands of views. The caption read, simply, "HOA Lady versus Nature," and that was enough to turn her tantrum into a spectacle. By the next morning, the clip had spread across neighborhood forums and jumped to larger platforms. People shared it with laughing emojis, remixing her screams into songs, looping her frantic gestures into endless GIFs. Karen, who once commanded respect through intimidation, had become an unwilling internet character. She had always wanted recognition, and now she had it in the worst possible way. The irony of her performance becoming entertainment was not lost on the neighbors. Some of them admitted they had replayed the video several times, not out of cruelty, but because it felt like justice finally had a face. For years, she had wielded her clipboard and fake notices like weapons. Now the world was laughing at her instead of bowing to her. What fascinated me most was how strangers reacted online. People who had never set foot in our neighborhood were suddenly experts on HOA abuse, sharing their own stories of power-hungry board members and petty enforcers. Karen had unwittingly become the poster child for every bad neighbor across the country. The comment sections were filled with variations of the same sentiment. She got what was coming to her. Her response, of course, was to double down. She created a post on the neighborhood page, declaring herself the victim of ecological sabotage. She claimed the caterpillar invasion was a targeted act meant to destroy her home and endanger the entire block. Yet every time she tried to present her story, the viral video drowned her out. It was hard to argue with the sight of her flailing in her yard, while children's laughter rang in the background. For once, her voice was not the loudest. The internet had taken control of the narrative, and Karen had become a meme. In the court of public opinion, she was no longer the enforcer of rules. She was the punchline, and the laughter echoed louder than any citation she had ever written. Karen's next move was exactly what everyone expected. When her threats of HOA violations failed to silence me and the swarm of caterpillars continued their slow banquet, she pivoted to her favorite weapon, the law. One afternoon, a thick envelope appeared on my doorstep, stuffed with papers that looked official enough to intimidate someone who had never dealt with her before. The words, "Notice of Intent to Pursue Legal Action," were printed across the top, followed by pages filled with accusations. According to her, I had intentionally released a dangerous infestation onto her property, caused thousands of dollars in damages, and jeopardized the safety of the neighborhood. She demanded restitution, fines, and immediate removal of what she called biological warfare agents. I read through the stack while sitting at my kitchen table, each line more absurd than the last. She had even included photographs of her half-eaten roses, printed on glossy paper, and annotated with arrows pointing to caterpillars circled in red ink. The language she used was designed to sound like courtroom testimony, but the more I read, the less convincing it became. What she did not know, and what made me smile as I set the papers aside, was that I still had the receipt, the same slip with her name on it, showing the purchase of industrial acid. She could scream about infestations all she wanted, but there was no judge alive who would overlook the proof of her sabotage. I decided to call her bluff. Rather than panicking, I forwarded the entire packet to my attorney, who had already been briefed on her antics. His response was short and almost amused. "She has no case." He explained that not only did her claim lack evidence, but the receipt I had in my possession turned the tables completely. If she wanted to drag this to court, she would be the one answering questions about chemical vandalism and falsified notices. Karen must have sensed that her legal posturing was failing, because the following week her threats shifted from letters to angry tirades shouted from her porch. She yelled about lawsuits and criminal charges to anyone within earshot, but her voice carried less power than it once had. The neighbors had already seen the truth. The more she threatened, the more desperate she appeared, and the less anyone cared to listen. It was almost poetic when the county inspector showed up. For years, Karen had paraded around as if she alone held the authority of every code and regulation in the book. She had barked orders about paint colors, measured lawns with a ruler, and left notices on people's doors like she was the sheriff of some suburban outpost. So, when a real official walked up her driveway, clipboard in hand and badge clipped to his belt, it felt like a stage curtain finally pulling back on the truth. I watched from my porch as he examined the property. He bent down near the storm drain, where runoff from her yard collected, and lifted his eyebrows at the sight of empty containers lined against the garage wall. Their labels were clear, even from a distance. Weed killers, cleaners, bottles with hazard symbols printed in red. He spoke with her for a while, his voice calm and even, hers growing louder and sharper as she gestured wildly toward my house. From the tone of their exchange, it was obvious she was trying to spin her story about infestations and sabotage. The inspector was not interested in caterpillars. He was interested in the way chemicals had been disposed of. He checked the soil around her flower beds, wrote something down, and then walked to the edge of the lawn where the grass had yellowed in strange patterns. Karen followed at his heels, pointing and insisting that her property had been attacked. He finally turned and told her in plain language that improper use and storage of hazardous substances was a violation that carried heavy fines. Her face went pale for a moment, the first crack in her confidence I had ever seen. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. By evening, everyone knew that the woman who had built her reputation on enforcing rules had been cited for breaking them. Neighbors who once whispered their complaints now laughed openly. Children rode past her house on bicycles, singing improvised songs about acid grass and poison roses. I stood in my yard that night looking at the blackened remnants of my own flowers and felt a strange sense of justice. She had tried to ruin me with chemicals, but in the end, those same chemicals were what brought officials to her door. It was not my word against hers anymore. It was her own actions written in the soil, stamped on the bottles, and documented on the clipboard of someone she could not bully. Her lawn had once been the neighborhood's crown jewel. Every blade of grass stood upright, trimmed to a uniform height, green as though it had been dyed. She used to boast that her yard was the standard everyone else should follow, the proof that order and control produced beauty. But as the days passed after the caterpillars arrived, the transformation was undeniable. What had been lush and vibrant became patchy, the color fading in uneven stripes. The insects worked without pause, chewing through her hedges, roses, and finally, the very grass she guarded like treasure. I would glance across the street each morning and notice new scars spreading through the yard. Brown spots appeared first, scattered like freckles, then widened until whole sections of turf collapsed. The hedges lost their symmetry, holes gnawed right through their perfect cube shapes. The roses that had been her pride were stripped bare, stems jutting up like skeletal fingers against the sky. She tried everything, sprays, powders, even covering sections with tarps, but the swarm simply found new roots and new meals. The more she fought, the worse it looked. Neighbors gathered on sidewalks to watch, whispering with a mix of amusement and disbelief. For years she had lectured them about lawn maintenance, fined them for leaving dandelions or clover patches, and mocked anyone whose yard was less than immaculate. Now she was the one whose grass looked sickly and wild. It was as if nature had chosen her property to demonstrate that perfection cannot be commanded forever. I will admit there was a grim satisfaction in watching her empire collapse. Where she had once stood proudly with her clipboard, she now stomped across her yard, muttering under her breath, clutching spray bottles and trash bags like makeshift weapons. She could not hide the damage. Anyone walking by could see the once flawless lawn unraveling into a wasteland. At night, the porch lights shone across what had become a battlefield. The soil, scarred, the plants stripped down to nothing. Her yard, which had been her weapon against the rest of us, now told the story of her downfall in plain view. It was not vandalism. It was simply nature reminding her that no one, not even the loudest Karen on the block, could keep control forever. Karen was never one to retreat quietly. When the fines from the inspector arrived and her lawn resembled a patchwork of brown scars, she shifted her battlefield from grass to screens. She began a furious campaign online, posting daily on the neighborhood forum, tagging city officials, and even creating her own public page where she called herself a defender of community safety. Every post told the same story. According to her, I was a malicious saboteur who had unleashed a plague upon her home. She wrote long paragraphs about ecological terrorism, insisting that caterpillars had been deliberately planted to destroy property values and endanger families. The problem was that her words collided with the viral videos already spreading through the internet. Neighbors and strangers alike had shared clips of her shrieking in the garden, her arms flapping wildly while caterpillars chewed calmly at her roses. People had remixed her screams into comedy sketches and looped her stumbling into flower beds with upbeat music. The more she posted, the more material she fed into the mockery machine. Comments poured in faster than she could delete them, mocking her attempts at sounding professional while attaching screenshots of the acid receipt that had already circulated online. She tried to frame herself as the victim of a neighborhood conspiracy. She wrote that the inspector had been bribed, that the neighbors were colluding, and that I was orchestrating a harassment campaign to push her out, but her explanations grew more tangled with each post. She contradicted herself openly, at one point insisting that caterpillars had been genetically engineered, at another that they had been smuggled from overseas, and later that I had been breeding them in my basement. Instead of winning sympathy, she became entertainment. Strangers began commenting with pictures of butterflies, telling her that nature had better lawyers than she did. Some neighbors, who had once kept silent, joined in, replying with their own stories of her harassment, finally emboldened to speak where they would be heard by more than just the block. Her posts remained up for weeks, each one more frantic than the last, but her credibility dissolved with every paragraph. What she thought was a campaign of damage control became a spiral of public humiliation. For the first time, her voice was not only challenged but laughed at. She had always relied on fear to make people obey. Fear had evaporated, and all that remained was ridicule. The neighborhood began to feel lighter once her grip started to slip. People who had once kept their blinds drawn when she walked past began lingering on porches, waving to one another, even laughing at the absurdity of her online rants. It was as though the spell she had cast over the block with her constant threats and notices had finally been broken. Instead of isolating us, her behavior had pulled everyone together. The first sign of change came when the Johnsons hosted a cookout in their driveway. For years, they had avoided gatherings, worried that Karen would show up with her clipboard and cite them for noise or unapproved decorations. This time, they didn't care. They set up a grill, strung lights across the yard, and invited the entire street. People came out in folding chairs, carrying casseroles and desserts, and for the first time since I had moved in, the block felt like a community rather than a collection of houses under surveillance. As the night stretched on, conversation circled back to Karen. Not in whispers or fearful tones, but in open laughter. Neighbors traded stories of her most ridiculous complaints, from claiming a child's tricycle was a safety hazard to insisting someone repaint their front door because it was too cheerful. It was strange and comforting hearing these tales spill out, each one proof that I hadn't been singled out, that we had all endured her reign in silence until now. The more people shared, the more a sense of solidarity grew. Plans were made for group gardening projects, block watch meetings that didn't involve her, and even a neighborhood newsletter that would focus on birthdays and events instead of fines and warnings. She had tried to divide us through intimidation, but in the end, she united us by giving everyone a common enemy. Looking around at the smiling faces lit by string lights and fireflies, I realized she no longer held the power she thought she did. The fear had shifted into something stronger: connection. We had all discovered that when one person stands up, others find the courage to follow. Her downfall wasn't just about my flowers or her lawn. It was about neighbors finally remembering what it felt like to stand together. Spring rolled into early summer, and with it came a transformation that no one in the neighborhood had expected. The caterpillars that had stripped Karen's lawn bare began to vanish, but they did not simply disappear. They re-emerged as wings. One by one, cocoons clinging to her hedges and fence posts split open, releasing clouds of butterflies that drifted lazily across the street. It was as though the wreckage of her garden had been reborn into a living parade. At first, it startled people. Children pointed and chased after the delicate creatures, laughing as they danced through the air. Neighbors stopped in their tracks during evening walks, craning their necks upward to marvel at the sudden explosion of color. Hundreds of butterflies turned the block into a spectacle, fluttering in golden light, settling on porches, perching on mailboxes, then lifting off again in waves. It was magical, the kind of sight you might pay to see in a conservatory, only it was happening for free right in our front yards. Everyone loved it except Karen. To her, the butterflies were not a miracle, but a reminder. She stormed out with a broom, swiping at the air, shouting about infestations even as neighbors pulled out their phones to film the display. The more she tried to shoo them away, the more ridiculous she looked, swatting at something that was harmless and beautiful. People laughed openly now, no longer hiding behind curtains. The butterflies ignored her fury, drifting instead toward the rest of us. They landed in my garden, which had begun to recover after the acid attack, and their presence felt like a strange form of blessing. The same creatures that had destroyed her perfect order were now giving the neighborhood a gift she could not claim. Children collected photographs for school projects, parents told their kids it was a sign of renewal, and the air buzzed with excitement each evening when the butterflies gathered in glowing clusters. Karen slammed her doors and pulled her blinds, but she could not escape the sight. Every time she looked out her window, she saw the evidence of her failure taking flight. Where she had poured acid and tried to stamp out life, nature had answered with wings, reminding everyone that beauty cannot be dictated or destroyed without consequence. For the rest of us, it was a season of wonder. For her, it was a season of torment written across the sky. Her yard had become a battlefield, and eventually, even the people she paid to maintain it refused to step foot on it. For years, Karen had boasted about her landscaping crew, how they followed her instructions down to the inch, trimming hedges into perfect cubes and mowing in flawless diagonal lines. She treated them less like workers and more like soldiers carrying out her vision of suburban perfection. But after the caterpillars arrived, those soldiers laid down their tools. The first time the crew pulled up after the infestation, they lasted no more than 20 minutes. They unloaded their mowers and trimmers, but within moments they were surrounded by a carpet of crawling green bodies. The men swatted at their arms and legs as the insects fell from bushes onto their uniforms. One of them shouted something about hazardous conditions and tossed his gloves back into the truck. Another snapped photographs of the ruined roses, muttering about how no amount of labor could save them. By the time Karen marched outside with her clipboard to bark orders, the crew was already loading everything back into the truck. She argued with them in the driveway, waving her arms, insisting they were contractually obligated to restore her lawn. They shook their heads, pointing at the chewed leaves and the writhing branches, explaining that no chemical or tool could fix what was happening. One of them told her flatly that the yard needed time and nature, not endless sprays and demands. She stomped her foot and threatened to withhold payment, but they only laughed bitterly and said the job wasn't worth the hazard. Then they drove away, leaving her standing in the middle of her crumbling empire with a rake clutched in her hand. The neighborhood watched the scene unfold with fascination. For years she had used that crew as a symbol of her superiority, reminding everyone that her yard was tended by professionals while theirs was not. Now she was the one left alone, dragging a hose across dead grass and swinging clumsily at branches with dull shears. Without her team, her routines unraveled quickly. The lawn grew uneven, weeds sprouted in the cracks, and the caterpillars kept marching. Her pride had always been her perfect yard, but stripped of her loyal landscapers, she was just another homeowner battling nature with bare hands. And no matter how loud she shouted, there was no one left willing to follow her orders. The breaking point came when the neighborhood gathered to vote on the HOA presidency. For years, Karen had treated the position as her throne, issuing decrees about shutters and fences, dictating the height of grass, and handing out fines that were more imagined than real. She carried herself as if the role had been granted for life, but the infestation, the acid attack, the viral videos, and the inspector's visit had stripped away the illusion of authority. What was left was a woman clinging to power with nothing but noise. The meeting was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon at the community center. Usually these gatherings attracted a handful of reluctant homeowners, but this time the room was full. People who had not attended in years arrived early, whispering in clusters, trading stories, and waiting for the moment they had quietly dreamed of. Karen walked in late, dressed sharply as if clothes could restore dignity, and carried a thick binder under her arm. She tried to command the room, calling for order and beginning with a speech about conspiracies, infestations, and neighborhood decline. Her words echoed, but they no longer landed. When the time came to nominate candidates, a voice from the back suggested Bob Fletcher, the retired teacher who had lived there longer than anyone and who had always been known for his calm fairness. Applause broke out before Karen could even respond. She attempted to dismiss the nomination, waving her arms and insisting that bylaws required consistency of leadership, but the room pushed back. Voices rose together, reminding her that the presidency was not a crown. It was a role to be chosen, and the choice was not hers alone. The vote was quick, almost startling in its simplicity. Hands shot up for Bob, far more than for her, and when the count was read aloud, the outcome was clear. Karen's reign ended in less than 5 minutes. The silence that followed was heavy, then broken by the sound of people clapping, some of them laughing through the relief. For the first time since I had moved to the neighborhood, the atmosphere felt free of her shadow. She sat stiffly in her chair, binder clutched in her lap, eyes darting around the room for allies who were no longer there. Her voice, once the only one people feared, was drowned out by the collective decision of neighbors, who had finally remembered that power was theirs to share, not hers to hoard. Her downfall did not come with one final explosion of drama, but with the quiet persistence of time. The flowers I replanted in my yard began to bloom again, their colors brighter than before, as if determined to reclaim what had been taken. My roses unfurled in deep crimson, the hydrangeas returned with soft blues and purples, and the lilies stood tall in the sunlight. Neighbors stopped to admire them, smiling in a way that reminded me of how things had been before Karen tried to turn beauty into a battlefield. Across the street, her property told the opposite story. The grass remained scarred, patches of brown stubbornly spreading no matter how many times she watered or reseeded. The hedges were uneven and hollow, their once perfect shapes now jagged reminders of the swarm that had passed through. The roses she had treasured so much were reduced to thorny stems that struggled to push out a single bloom. Every time she stepped outside, she was met with a yard that reflected her own failure. It was not just the plants that changed. The way the neighborhood looked at her was different too. People no longer lowered their voices or avoided her gaze. They spoke openly, laughed in groups, and invited one another to gatherings without worrying about her disapproval. Children rode their bikes past her house singing butterfly songs, while parents waved from porches without fear of a citation landing in their mailbox. The control she had thrived on had vanished, leaving her isolated even in the place she had once ruled. For me, the sweetest part was not the chaos of the caterpillars or the spectacle of her tantrums. It was the balance that followed. My garden healed, the community grew stronger, and she had to live every day with the visible scars of her own arrogance. The irony was impossible to ignore. Her acid had ruined my flowers, but it had also triggered the chain of events that led to her humiliation. She had poured poison into the soil, and in return, nature had delivered justice with wings and mandibles. Standing on my porch one quiet evening, I realized revenge had not been the point at all. What mattered was that her cruelty had been answered, her power had been broken, and life had blossomed again where she tried to destroy it. And that, my friends, is how an HOA tyrant learned the hard way, that nature always finds balance, and sometimes that balance comes in the form of 10,000 hungry caterpillars. If you've ever had a Karen weaponize neighborhood rules against you, drop your story in the comments. Trust me, venting helps. Hit subscribe for more tales of entitled people getting dethroned, and remember this: flowers bloom again, but a Karen's reputation, once chewed through, it never grows back. Until next time, may your lawn stay green, your neighbors stay sane, and your karma arrive right on schedule.